Hello and welcome to my channel. It is March 30, 2021, and we're going to go over some news and politics today. As you can see from the title, the evil voter ID laws versus the good COVID ID laws. I kind of figured that the comparison of the two are very similar, but however they're being treated quite differently, and I just don't understand it. My understanding of the ID or the voter IDs, it's harder for minorities to get an ID. However, I always found it easy to get an ID, and whenever I go to my local DMV, I see all walks of life getting their IDs without any issues whatsoever. But however, I did find this interesting article from the awesome people over at Vox, you know, the wonderful journalism over there, with an interesting headline. A majority studies finding that voter ID laws hurt minorities isn't standing up well to under scrutiny. This was by German Lopez. This was written on March 15, 2018. It was supposed to be the study that proved voter ID laws are not just discriminatory, but can also have a big impact on elections. And was picked up widely with outlets including Think Progress and the Washington Post, reporting that the studies found voter ID laws hurt the Hispanic voters in particular and skewed elections to the right. But a follow-up study suggests that these findings that were originally were bunk, according to research at Stanford, Yale, and the University of Pennsylvania. The original study was based on a survey of voters that are extremely unreliable, skewing the results. On top of that, several calculation errors led to even more problems. And when the errors were corrected, the follow-up researchers found that there was no evidence in analyzing the data that voter IDs have statistically significantly impacted the voter turnout. In other words, it's possible that the voter ID laws still have impacts on elections, but the original study just doesn't have the data to prove it. But we're going to write an article anyways. The findings aren't too surprising. Looking at the broader research of empirical evidence has tended to find that voter ID laws have a small impact. While there still may be racial discrimination and unnecessarily, ultimately voter ID laws may not have a strong enough effort on voter turnout based on available research so far to swing anything but the closest election, and the newest study backs that up. A new study suggests voter IDs have little to no impact on minority. The previous study, published back in January by the TRIO Research at UC San Diego, Michigan State University, and Bucknell University, used the 2006 to 2014 data from the Cooperative Congressional Election Studies to study the effect of voter ID laws. They concluded analysts shows that the strict identification laws had differently negative impacts on the turnout of racial and ethnic minorities in primaries and general elections. We also find that voter laws all skewed democracies towards those politically right. Specifically, the research found that Hispanics voters are hit the hardest by ID. They wrote in the post, Hispanics are affected the most. Turnout is 7.1 percentage point lower in the general election and 5.3 lower in primaries in strict ID states than other states. Strict ID laws mean lower African American, Asian American, and multiracial American turnouts as well, while turnout is largely unaffected. Given that minority groups are likelier to vote Democrats, that may skew the election in conservative directions. basically a whole bunch of jumbo mumbo because we are dealing with the professionals at Vox. The data that the researcher relied on is notorious unreliable for voter ID study in a way that could skew the results. In the 2006, the estimate turnout rate was 10 points below the actual turnout in 15 states, which showed practically zero turnout according to the CCES. Virginia had almost no validated voters in 2008 as well, given the error in 2006 study. That year is not suitable for use in our nor is the Virginia records in 2008. But the researchers included these data in their analysis in a new study stated. The study main model didn't count for variables that could have influenced the results. The model had successfully controlled overall variable besides the voter ID that would have been able to find, for example, all the states without voter ID laws had roughly the same voter turnout. This is not the case according to the follow-up. The follow-up replication suggests that turnout was about 6% points lower in places that will adopt a strict ID law, meaning that the model picked up an effect on voter turnout before a state actually passed the voter ID law, suggesting that it's picking up something else that is correlating but not the cause by voter ID laws. I think this is pretty much stating the fact that voter ID laws have zero or the very little impacts unless someone could actually give me concrete proof how their race is. This is from the News and Observer. Does requiring a photo ID to vote discriminate against minorities? NC leaders weigh in. North Carolina Influence Series. More than half of North Carolina leaders who responded to a new survey that says requiring a photo ID to discriminate against minorities. Voters across the state will see 6 constitutional amendments on the ballots for November election. One amendment would require voters to show photo identification for future elections. 60 North Carolina leaders in education, political business, and advocacies were asked in an open-ended questions about race relations in the state as part of North Carolina Influencers Series, the Charlotte Observer, the News and Observer, and the blah, 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 blah. They were asked if race relations has changed in North Carolina within the last 10 years. Of course they have. And whether they have experienced discrimination because of their race. They were also asked about showing identification at polls. Among the 49 leaders who responded, 29 says requiring a voter ID would pose a threat of discriminating against minority. 11 said it would not pose a threat, while 9 didn't clearly say one way or the other. Their answers fell along racial, gender, and political lines. Among African Americans responded, 85% said the photo requirement would pose a threat to discrimination against minority voters, compared to 60% of Hispanics responded and 48% of the white responded. 68% of women and 50% of the men said the requirement could lead to racial discrimination. Meanwhile, 80% of the Democrats, 9% of Republicans, and 50% of unaffiliated responded said so. Unfortunately, I'm not going to read this one because this is a bunch of jumbo. Because everybody has a driver's license. If they don't have a driver's license, they have identification numbers. But however, Biden administration and private companies are working to develop a standard way of handling credentials, often referred to as a vaccine passport, that will allow Americans to prove they've been vaccinated against the novel coronavirus as business try to reopen. The effort has gained momentum amid the President Biden's pledge that the nation will start regaining normalcy this summer, and with growing numbers of companies, from cruise lines to sports teams, saying that they would require proof of vaccinations before opening their doors again. The administration initiative had been driven largely by the arms of the Department of Health and Human Services, including an office devoted to the health and information technology, says the 5 officials who spoke on condition of anonymity. discussed the effort. The White House this month took a bigger role coordinating government agencies involved in the work, led by coronavirus coordinator. Yeah, whatever. The White House declined to answer questions about the passport initiative, instead of pointing to the public statements about that Zeph offered made this month. Our role is to help ensure any solution in this area would be simple, free, open source, accessible to the people both digitally and on paper. Design. So, voting ID laws are racist, but however, an ID showing you've been vaccinated is not racist. Please explain to me in a sane, reasonable argument how the two differ, other than one is required to vote and the other one has shown that you've been vaccinated to a mostly safe but deadly virus. Anyways, that's about all. Leave your comments down below on what your thoughts are. Smash the like and subscribe button on all platforms. But most importantly, have yourself a wonderful day, morning, or evening.